Hello, everyone, and welcome back to B.A.S.E Line Tech Talk, where we navigate the evolving intersection of AI, security, and ethics. Today, I'm joined by Lukas Madl, founder and CEO of Innovtic, a consultancy focused on responsible innovation, helping organizations embed ethics directly into technologies, products, and business models in ways that are both people-centered and sustainable. Luca brings over 30 years of experience across sectors, from pharma to robotics to Earth observation, and is a For Humanity Fellow and certified auditor. He is also part of the broader leadership ecosystem at the Association of AI Ethicists. A special thanks to Enrico Panay, president of the association, for connecting us. It feels fitting that this conversation began through a network built around ethical responsibility, because today's discussion is exactly about that: how we move from principles we admire to systems we can actually trust. Before we dive in, here's the lens for today. The EU AI Act tells us what trustworthy AI should look like, but most teams struggle with the how. Lucas's work sits exactly in that gap, showing how value-based engineering, VBE, grounded in IEEE 7000 approach, can translate ethics and fundamental rights into traceable requirements and real engineering decisions. So Lucas, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Lucas, so let's start with the first question. In your articles, you describe a familiar problem. The EU AI Act is ambitious, but implementation sometimes gets messy, risk classification is complex, GPAI governance is evolving, harmonized standards sometimes lag behind, and fundamental rights can feel very abstract to engineers. If you had to name the single biggest reason compliance efforts can fail in practice, what is it, and what's the first mindset shift you try to create when you work with product teams?
Well, I think the main reason compliance fails is that it is viewed as an external burden rather than an internal responsibility, so to say. In my experience, innovation practice, compliance is often perceived as another tedious task, something added on the top of already highly complex and time-consuming and costly innovation processes. As a result, management and innovation teams are understandable, tempted to postpone it as long as possible and then to get it done as quickly as possible. This is why compliance is often experienced as a barrier, actually, to innovation, rather than a guidance for creating better products. And I think this is where ethics come in, because the real question is, how can we design systems in ways that are genuinely good for people? That's the point. And to reduce, of course, risks as far as possible. And this is, in fact, that's actually the core purpose of the AI Act. Not to hinder innovation, as many people argue, but to ensure that AI systems are trustworthy. In the language of the Act, this means systems that are safe and that respect fundamental rights. Now, that gets tricky because as a society, we have learned over centuries that machines can be physically dangerous. That is why cars must have reliable brakes, engine must be designed that they do not explode, things like that. The challenge with the digital world and especially with AI is, however, more complex. A system can be dangerous not only on the physical, on the biological level, but also on the psychological, on the mental level, on social levels. Yeah, it can influence our behavior, emotions, autonomy, democracy. So these risks are far more difficult to grasp and cannot easily be addressed with traditional engineering thinking methods and approaches. So the mindset I try to foster in innovation teams is this. Ethical orientation is not about ticking boxes. It's about taking responsibility for the real world impact of the technologies we bring to the market. So as its core, ethics asks the fundamental question, how can we build technologies that are truly beneficial for people? And I mean that in a holistic sense, beneficial for people. So in these questions, if these questions are only introduced very late in the development process, then compliance inevitably becomes a really heavy burden. But if those questions are integrated very early on, ethics turns into a source of motivation and guidance rather than an obstacle. That is where we are going for. So for innovators and entrepreneurs, the key question then shifts from how do I get around regulation to how do I design technology that really benefits people and avoids unnecessary harm. And when teams see ethics not as something imposed from outside, but as part of their own identity, I think this really changed everything.
Very nicely put. All right, so let's move from the why it fails to the how we fix it. You argue that VBE can bridge regulatory intent and technical implementation through multiple factors like deep contextual analysis, really stakeholder engagement, or translation of values into ethical value requirements. So can you walk us a bit through what VBE looks like in motion, from value to requirement to decision design? And what makes it different from the usual ethics checklist that you mentioned?
Yeah, good question. Value-based engineering works in three connected phases. And the key idea is to move from understanding of the values which are involved to the requirements, to concrete design decisions. So the first part is we start with a concept and context exploration. Before even we start to build anything, we step back and ask, what kind of problem actually do we want to solve? And for whom? And in which real-world context? We look at the stakeholders affected, at the social, legal, ethical requirement. So here's the shift from what can we build to what should we build. But what does really make sense and avoid harms? So this should happen in the first step early in the innovation process, while decisions are still very all open and flexible. Now, the second phase is the value exploration, as we call it. Here, values are explored. They are not assumed, they are found. Which values are really important to look at? Through stakeholder engagement, through use case analysis, we then identify those values which really matter in this specific context, be it safety, dignity, fairness, trust, autonomy, etc., etc. And we also look at the tensions between values, because there are often tensions. There's often a conflict. So what to do with this conflict? So this phase, the second phase, creates a clear value orientation that guides us later in the process. And the third part then is ethical, so-called ethical aligned design. This is where the values we have identified become really actionable. The values are then translated by us and by the teams in so-called ethical value requirements, or EVRs. So these are concrete requirements for the systems. They shape the design decisions. So it's the bridge between the more, you could say, philosophical level of values to the very concrete, tangible values level of system design. So these EVRs directly shape the decisions like data selection, which model we should use, explainability questions, human oversight, you name it. And I think this makes value-based engineering quite different from typical ethics checklist approach. Checklist starts with a predefined subset of principles where you should look at, and you ask if you comply to these principles or values. But with VBE, we really start with the context, discover all values which are important to look at, not look just at a list, and then systematically engineer, them into the requirements and the design decisions. That's it, actually.
I want to pick up on that last point because it connects a bit directly to assurance. So, given your perspective across both the advisory but also the audit, what evidence actually matters when organizations need to show they behave responsibly, not just claim it?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, that's a very important question. How can you make a system really trustworthy and demonstrate that it is trustworthy? And for that, you need actually kind of audits, as you have just said, which are independent organizations, independent consultants, independent, also notified bodies, of course. And in my understanding, this is similar also like financial auditors. They have the responsibility to kind of step into an organization on behalf of the public, review the documents against criteria, predefined criteria. And this is where, for example, for humanity, the Organization for Humanity is doing an incredible, important work in developing this concrete, auditable criteria to ensure that AI systems are not only claimed to be lawful and ethical, but actually can be assessed against this criteria. So it's very important. I mean, for auditors, they don't look at glossy AI principles, beautiful written AI policies. Those things don't carry much weight on their own. What auditors have to see is traceability and demonstrability. For example, as an auditor, you want to see how risks for a specific AI system were identified. How had those risks been assessed? Which mitigation measures were chosen? And why those measures were considered appropriate? For example, it's not enough to say, we ensure fairness. How to ensure it? Or we respect fundamental rights. What do you actually do? Is the fairness defined in the specific context? What metric are you using? What threshold applies? Who monitors actually? What happens if the system fails to meet the criteria? Yeah. So I think ultimately compliance and the auditability is about showing that the system is really controlled, monitored, and accountable, not just well intended, As an auditor, you don't assess the motivation, but you assess the controls. Yeah, and this is in a nutshell how to show evidence and responsibility.
Absolutely.
As
I
an
mean, as you
organization.
said, we need quantifiable metrics, we need thresholds, not just beautiful policies. But I think that idea of accountability sometimes becomes kind of harder to pin down, especially when we see systems that are starting to interact with each other. So we used to
Yes.
worry, I think, about humans influencing AI, and now it's AI influencing AI, and that's a completely different game. A few months ago, Moltbook was right at the center of that debate. It gave us really a front row seat to what that actually looks like when agents move from social to operational, when they're connected to tools, permissions, workflows. So my question to you is, what are the 3 guardrails you'd put in place from day one to stop influence becoming authority?
Difficult question. Well, I think before I directly try to answer your question, which is really a heavy one, I, I want to begin with to clarify that it is important to understand the distinction between AI and humans, and including large language models and AI agents. If you look at it closely, they don't possess human-like thought. They simulate as they would think like humans. But the difference is fundamental for our further consideration. So in philosophical terms, it is helpful to differentiate between dianoetic and noetic intelligence. Dianoetic intelligence is a step-by-step rule-based thinking. It involves analysis, calculation, inference, problem solving through operations. So it's you reason through something. This is what we are calling dianoetic intelligence. But it's not the same as noetic intelligence, which is the direct, holistic understanding. It involves grasping meaning, context, values, principle as a whole. You often you get it intuitively and not like in a process. You understand something as a human being as meaningful, as appropriate, without running through steps. Now, humans use both. The analytic intelligence, we also calculate, we make plans, we follow logic, etc. But very important also, and this is the bigger part, the noetic intelligence, where we exercise judgment, ethical insight, practical wisdom, contextual understanding, also sensing what is fair, appropriate, etc. So you see, the noetic intelligence is grounds our understanding what means responsibility, what actually are values. Now, AI agents only operate on the dianoetic level, but and that's the tricky part. It seems so, as they also understand things. They understand meaning, they understand context, etc. But that's only a simulation. And so this is very important to understand the difference. AI cannot understand what ought to matter. So from this basis, I think what is important that to ensure that AI agents actually do not take a dangerous life of their own or something like that. I think it's a very hot topic, very hot. I would say one guardrail meaningful human control must be preserved. As you've said, and we know AI agents act more and more autonomously, but humans must remain in command. System must be designed in such a way that humans can understand, supervise, intervene, and override, and actually turn off agentic behavior and practice. So I think that's very important. Second guardrail could be more accountability to the organizations responsible for AI agents. The more tasks you see AI agents take over, the more autonomous they are, the more real-world impact AI agents have, the clearer responsibility and liability structures must be. No responsibility gaps, I think, are acceptable. Someone, some organization, some person, not a machine, must always be accountable. I would say that's another very important guardrail. And the third one, I would say, well, very simple. AI agents should not harm. And I think AI agents intensify ethical risks, as I've mentioned before, because they could be so deeply embedded in personal, social, organizational, like processes and routines, that we even don't realize how they influence ourselves. And this can be very subtle and influence our decisions, preferences, autonomy. And from that, harm can arise. For example, unintentional bias, misuse, malicious attacks, etc. So we have to have systems or guardrails in place which protect us from those potential consequences. Yeah, so I would say humans must remain meaningfully in control.
Very well
Expanded
put.
yeah, just summary. Meaningful control, expanded autonomy must come with expanded accountability, and harm prevention must be in place. I think that's very important.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Lukas. I think what this conversation makes clear is how quickly things move from clarity to
Yes,
complexity. It's one thing,
exactly.
I think, to define responsible AI, and another to translate it into design, test it under scrutiny, and make sense of it once systems start interacting on their own, as you said. I think that tension between control and unpredictability, but also uncertainty, is really where the challenge sits today.
Sure. Sure.
So that brings us to
Completely.
the end of today's episode of Baseline Tech Talk. A special thank you again to our guest, Lukas Madl, for helping us unpack how ethics can move from aspiration to engineering practice. Stay tuned as we continue exploring the forces shaping AI's role in our world, right here where technology meets ethics and security. Thanks for listening, and until next time, this is Maribel Chafan signing off.